Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is the second video in a series entitled From Sioux Massacres to Dakota Genocide, the U.S. Dakota War in Minnesota's Newspapers. Today, I'll be talking about a curriculum that was developed by me for the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies out of a larger research project. To find out more about the larger research project, please see the video that my colleague Joe Eggers recorded about the research project. To access the curriculum, you can use the link z.umn.edu/newspapercurriculum. The curriculum is free and it's available here, and also you can download it from the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies website. Before I talk about the curriculum, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. This is something that I do in my work and my practice as a researcher and an educator. I'd like to first say that whether we're in Minnesota or in what is today the United States or North America, all teaching and learning takes place on Indigenous land. I acknowledge that the University of Minnesota, and especially the Twin Cities campus, stands on Minnesota Makoche, the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary homelands of the Dakota people. The university occupies land that was cared for and called home by the Dakota peoples and nation from time immemorial. Seated in the treaties of 1837 and 1851, these treaties were later abrogated by the United States government following the U.S. Dakota War. I acknowledge that this land has always held and continues to hold great spiritual and personal significance for the Dakota. By offering this land acknowledgement, I recognize the sovereignty of the Dakota, and I acknowledge, support, and advocate for the Dakota and Indigenous individuals and communities who live on this land now, and for those forcibly removed from their homelands. I will continue to raise awareness of Indigenous nations, peoples, histories, and culture in my work, both my research and teaching, especially within social studies education. And I will continue to hold the University of Minnesota accountable for Dakota and other Indigenous peoples and nations, or accountable to, rather, Dakota and other Indigenous peoples and nations. It is my sincere hope that this curriculum project that I'll discuss in the video here today will serve as a catalyst for teachers, educators, community leaders to recognize settler colonial narratives and to engage in truth-telling in social studies and other classrooms across Minnesota. And I'm thinking specifically of my colleagues who teach 6th grade Minnesota studies. So just for a little introduction, my name again is George Delbo, and I serve as the Educational Outreach Coordinator for the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I'm also a PhD student at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction and Social Studies Education. And my research focuses on so-called difficult narratives in especially social studies curricula and classrooms, like genocide, other instances of mass violence and human rights violations. I'm also a middle and high school social studies teacher, and I've taught both in the Twin Cities in Minnesota and in Wisconsin. And so I was brought into a much larger research project that has been going on for years at the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And that larger research project sought to understand how the U.S. Dakota War of 1862 has been represented in the public sphere, public discourse, the collective memory within the state of Minnesota over both time. So thinking about the last 150 years, but also space. So thinking about how narratives of the U.S. Dakota War are different, or how they change if we were to travel from, let's say, the Minnesota River Valley, where the fighting took place in and around the cities of Mankato and New Ulm, to the cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis, which are slightly removed, but were then and are now, right, the largest city and the capital of the state of Minnesota, respectively. And so this project yielded, largely looking at newspapers and newspaper accounts of the war at 25-year intervals over the last 150 years from, as I mentioned, both the Minnesota River Valley and the Twin Cities, yielded a tremendous amount of really rich data. And so I was brought into this project to try to think about the ways in which this data might be turned into a series of lesson plans for students to engage with thinking through really this kind of essential question in the classroom. And so this curriculum is aimed specifically at 6th grade teachers and students, but could easily be modified to be used with students who are slightly younger and certainly into upper middle and into high school. Again, here's a link for the curriculum. This link is listed throughout the presentation, including on the last slide. And so before I jump into talking about the curriculum specifically, I want to talk a little bit about the theory that I used to guide some of the work in creating the curriculum. And this theory is referred to as settler colonial or settler colonialism theory. And really, before we jump into the theory, I think we need to just take a moment and think about the United States as a settler colonial nation state. And so settler colonial theory would assert that the United States, like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, other countries, right, are settler colonial nation states. And settler colonialism is different from other forms of colonialism in that settler colonialism is a system, a society in which settlers, often, certainly in the case of the United States or Minnesota, Euro-American settlers, took over land, removed the original indigenous inhabitants, and then settled that land. But I think also it's important to recognize that settlers settled this land in perpetuity. And so I myself am not indigenous. My family came over the last 300 years, right, to the United States, largely from Europe, and settled on land that was essentially stolen from indigenous communities, indigenous nations, indigenous peoples, and continue to live. And so here I live on land, right, that is indigenous land. And so to really try to understand settler colonialism and settler colonial theory a little better, we might imagine a triangle, right, or a pyramid. And if we think of settler colonial society or the settler colonial nation state like the United States as a pyramid, we might imagine that settlers are on the top, right? So at the very top of this, we have the settler. Settlers, as I mentioned, settle stolen land. Often they create laws and structures to legitimize the theft and continued dominance of that land over that land. They also dominate every other aspect of society as well. And we often associate this notion of settler with the idea of whiteness, and particularly in the United States. If we were to move down to the left of this triangle, right, we see this notion of Indian, and very much like settler, this is an identity that is often thrust upon people, right? I think it's important to remember that before 1492, there were no Indians, right? This is an identity that was given to a very diverse group of, at one point, millions and millions of people across the Americas, right, who were described by Europeans as Indians. And the Indian, right, in settler colonial society is removed from the land. Now, we could think about different ways in which this removal happens, everything from genocide, the wholesale killing of a group of people, the murder of a group of people, to forced relocation from, lands to other land. This notion of Indian is erased from contemporary society and contemporary discourse. Indians are often termed savages or similar, or often much worse. They're not seen as human. And we often associate this notion of Indian with the idea of Indianness, right? This identity that was created by Europeans and, taken up later by Euro-Americans. And if we think of, mascots from different sports teams and different sports franchises, highlight this idea of Indianness, right? That it continues today in many cases. If we move, and we'll talk less about this today, but I think it's equally important to think about chattel slaves. So on the right of this pyramid, the notion of chattel slavery is within a settler colonial society is that settlers settle this land, they remove the original inhabitants, and then they bring in a third population. In this case, in the case of the United States, Africans, right, who are, enslaved Africans who are brought here in bondage. And they're often held in that bondage. And we could argue, scholars argue, that this bondage continues today, even after slavery has formally ended, through things like debt or the prison system or even miseducation. The chattel slave is seen as property, not seen as human. They're restricted from owning land. Their bodies are valued, right, for the work that they can do, but not their personhood. And we often, like we might associate a settler with whiteness, we associate the chattel slave with blackness. And we could see an extension of this, right, in the prison industrial complex that exists within the United States. And certainly this could be represented likewise with logos and packaging, everything from Aunt Jemima's to Uncle Ben's. And then if we think about, what keeps this settler society, what gives it its shape, what keeps it in place, generation after generation, what gives it structure, are things like treaties and later laws, other institutions like policing, or we might talk about the school system as perpetuating settler colonialism and settler colonial society, transferring this from one generation to the next. And I often, because my work is in school, I often use, when I talk about settler colonialism, settler colonial theory, I often talk about the image American Progress that was painted by John Gast in 1872. And I know many of my colleagues use this to talk about Manifest Destiny. And I think we could use this to underscore how settler colonialism works, right? And the role of school in settler colonialism. And so this image, right, if you're not familiar with it, we have the figure of progress hovering over the landscape, moving westward, and you can see, bringing progress brings with her, everything from, the train lines, first the stagecoach and settlers, right, and covered wagons to the train lines, the railroads that will move from east to west. And if you look carefully in her hand, she's stringing along with her, perhaps a telegraph wire. And you can see that, being driven off the edge of the painting are the indigenous inhabitants, the original indigenous inhabitants of the land. And, progress is bringing even light with her and pushing out darkness. We see on her forehead the star of empire. And then I often ask students, both at the university level and, in middle and high school, what is the book that progress is carrying? What is this book that she's cradling in her arm? And, rightly so, students often suggest that it's the Bible. And I think that makes sense for how we think about colonialism. But if we think about settler colonialism in the United States in the late 1800s, and how settler colonialism is going to be passed from generation to generation, really, it's not the Bible. It's, if we look a little closer, it's a school book. It's curriculum. It's the curriculum that will be used, right, to spin a specific narrative about the United States that will keep settler colonialism. It will give it its shape, right? It'll keep it perpetuating generation after generation. And so if we think about this project and how I've taken up settler colonialism, really we're interested in kind of unsettling some of these settler narratives that are perpetuated through curriculum and indeed things like newspapers. And that'll be important for us to consider, especially because this project is looking at a settler archive of newspaper articles. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. So if we think about teaching the U.S. Dakota War, the U.S. Dakota War is most often in Minnesota taught in 6th grade in social studies. And if we look right to the right of the screen here, there's the standard. The U.S. Dakota War is mentioned only once in the 2011 Minnesota State Standards for Social Studies. And the standard says, explain reasons for the United States a Dakota War of 1862, compare and contrast the perspectives of settlers and Dakota people before, during, and after the war. And this is part of a larger unit on the Civil War and Reconstruction. And so as we were thinking about pulling this curriculum together, we were interested in understanding how the U.S. Dakota War is taught in Minnesota. And so we did a comprehensive survey of Minnesota social studies teachers, and we came away with the following results. So the majority of 6th grade social studies teachers spend only 2 or 3 days covering the war and its aftermath, which surprised us. We thought it would have been much more, this kind of pivotal moment in Minnesota history and indeed in U.S. history, though it's often not taught outside of Minnesota, but only 2 to 3 days on the war. The majority of these social studies teachers report resources, access to resources to be their biggest hurdle, their greatest hurdle in terms of teaching about the war. And many reported that they seek, in terms of their objectives for students or their objectives as teachers, they seek to teach both sides or both perspectives of the war. And I think by this, we've understood this to mean both a settler and a Dakota perspective. And I think this makes sense looking at the standard and the language of the standard that implores that teachers compare and contrast these two perspectives, the perspectives of settlers and Dakota people, both before, during, and after the war. And so we tried to think about a curriculum that might fit within some of this, but also challenge some of the ways in which the U.S. Dakota War perhaps is being taught within the state. And so one of the things that I think is important to talk about, and my colleague Joe referenced looking at the language that's used in these newspaper articles. So the curriculum really does ask students to go through and look at newspaper articles across both time and space. And one of the aspects of doing this within a classroom, and especially for 6th graders, is that you'll encounter language in older newspaper articles, but indeed even in some more contemporary articles that we would consider to be, if not, inappropriate, perhaps offensive, outright offensive. And so there are these derogatory terms that are used for Indigenous peoples, the terms like red devils, barbarians, savages, even red skins, or red man. You can see here's a clip from a paper that refers to Native Americans as savage devils. And I think it's important for teachers that are going to engage in, using this curriculum and engage in looking at some of these articles with students to make sure that they know their students. This language can be traumatizing for many Native students in classrooms. And indeed, it's important that teachers make sure that students are able to understand that this language exists in a particular time and place, and not to recreate it within the classroom. And so as we were as I was thinking about how to create a lesson, a set of lesson plans, I thought about this idea that teachers really are spending only 2 to 3 days, and perhaps there isn't a lot of room to add additional content into already fairly full curricula. And so what I did is I created a 1-day lesson. And so we refer to this as the core lesson. And this core really gets at the heart of the research project and asks students to look at some of these articles and analyze how narratives have developed and changed over time. If teachers and students have time to go beyond this one day, roughly 50-minute lesson, you could push on into a second day. And so this would be the 2-day lesson. You would begin with the core and then add a second day. And indeed, if you have time beyond that, there is a 3-day, a third lesson that you could add. And then there are some thoughts on multi-day extensions that I've included that could take anywhere from a week to 2 weeks, depending on the time that you have. Some of the questions that I was thinking about as I created this curriculum for students and teachers to kind of wrestle with as they move through, even if it's just the 1-day core lesson, is how do historical narratives and collective memory, and thinking about how these might be slightly different, historical narratives and collective memory, how do they change over time and space in Minnesota? And so this comes directly from the larger question from the research project. And then looking at questions like, how are public attitudes reflected in media reporting over time and space? What is the role of media, especially newspapers, in influencing the formation of collective memories and historical narratives? And so really pushing students to kind of think through how narratives are developed both with and in newspapers. And so again, some of the frameworks that the curriculum tries to have students and teachers think about and take up are things like settler colonialism, which I described earlier, or this notion of reading or rereading the settler colonial archive. And so really this curriculum is looking at dozens of newspaper articles that go all the way back to 1862 rather. And so thinking about how can we read this collection of newspaper articles that were largely written about Native Americans, not by or for Native Americans. And so how could we read or reread this archive that is within the curriculum, this archive of newspaper articles against the grain? How might we read for what is missing, or read these articles in this collection of articles rather critically? And then also I attempt to build in notions of authentic learning and assessment. And, in a short sense, Newman and his associates talk about authentic learning and assessment as having students in classrooms recreate the activities that are authentic to the social sciences. And so I really wanted students to go through and code, to analyze these newspaper articles the way that we did at the university as researchers engaged in this research project. So how could we have students do this same sort of work and draw conclusions in the same way that we as researchers were able to draw conclusions at the end of this research project? And so though it is certainly scaled down to be more manageable for teachers and 6th grade students, it mirrors the work that was being done at the university as part of the larger research project. And so that's what I mean by authentic. And then to engage in notions of critical media literacy. Now, how can we engage with things like newspapers in a critical way? And so the first lesson in the curricula, this core lesson, is on reading headlines. And so we ask students in an opening activity to look at headlines like Anniversary of Indian Massacre in Minnesota, or Retracing the War that Shaped Minnesota, and to think about, what can they observe in the language, the phrasing of these headlines? What do they think about the terms that are being used? And then, what questions do they still have as a way to kind of engage them in thinking about these narratives and how they've developed and shifted over time and space? And so you can see here a screenshot of part of that core curriculum. This is from a student student worksheets. So the curriculum does include plenty of worksheets that are reproducible to hand out to students to engage with in class. They could also be distributed to students electronically. And you can see there are examples of headlines. We tried to include screenshots of the actual headline from the black and white images of the newspapers, right from the archives at largely the Minnesota Historical Society. And so you can see headlines like "Battling the Stubborn Sioux." And this really asks students to go through in that far right column to make notes about what they're seeing in these headlines, and to really consider the years that these headlines are from, the newspapers, where these newspapers are being printed and published and distributed, who the audience would be, and then to come together and start to draw conclusions based on what they're seeing in these headlines. If you've covered these headlines and students have worked through and analyzed them, the second day gives students examples of newspaper articles, so longer and in some cases excerpts, but in most cases full-length articles from newspapers going all the way back to 1862, and asking students to go through and look at the language in more detail, not just the headlines, but the articles themselves. And so there is, again, here's a screenshot of a student handout that asks them to go through and start to code these articles, to think about things like the name of the newspaper, the author, perhaps the identity of the author. Is the author Indigenous or not? And can we tell? Can we not tell? Looking at things like the date, right, the name of the newspaper, and then digging deeper and looking at what sources are quoted in the newspaper. What is the language that's being used to describe the war, or to describe the Dakota, to describe settlers and their actions during the war? In some cases, to think about how the war is being remembered and commemorated, in the 25th anniversary, the 50th, and so on, all the way up to 2012 and the sesquicentennial. And then if students have gone through this first core lesson, the second lesson looking at newspaper articles in more detail, the third day lesson asks students to look at various representations of data. So this data is exactly the data that we pulled from our sample of 400 or 500 newspaper articles. And so students are asked to look at how the data is represented graphically in different forms. And so there are worksheets that ask students to first go through and make sure that they can understand the graphs and the charts that are being presented. There are 3 different examples. And then to analyze the data and to think about, how, these trends can be represented. And so to really think about research and how it might be represented in places like newspapers, for instance. And then if students have moved through these 3 lessons and you're still interested in doing more with this project, there are some ideas that are at the back of the curriculum on multi-day extensions. And so the first is asking students to essentially do what we did, to go to these archives that exist. Often they're open for students to look through with minimal registration, from places like the Library of Congress or the Minnesota Historical Society, to go through and find newspaper articles from perhaps their hometown. If this is being done outside of the Twin Cities or outside of the Minnesota River Valley, there are a lot of newspapers that can be found from places like St. Cloud, Duluth, Bemidji, that would look at how the war is been covered, right, over the last 150 years. And so you could have students engage in their own research and find articles and analyze them. And then a second multi-day extension would be to think about how we commemorate the war, and to think about monuments that exist in Minnesota today, and perhaps to think about monuments that could be. How might we take some of the monuments that have existed over time or that exist today and think about the language? And so this really asks students to draft text for a monument, and perhaps this is an existing monument in, let's say, the Minnesota River Valley or elsewhere, or perhaps you'll have students imagine that they're constructing a monument and adding text to that monument. And so what sort of language should be used, right? What language may have been used in the past, and what sort of language would we want to see in a monument today to represent Indigenous peoples, especially the Dakota or settlers or the U.S. Dakota War. And so certainly this curriculum, we're excited about the prospect of it. And so again, the link is here. We'd love to hear your thoughts and reactions, and especially if you've taken this up with students in your classroom, if you have feedback that would help shape subsequent drafts and iterations of this curriculum, that would be greatly appreciated. And I'll share my email address in just a moment. But I do want to offer a few words of caution. So this curriculum, I think there are a few points that are worth mentioning. So one is that it doesn't do much to help us push beyond this notion of two perspectives of the U.S. Dakota War, a Dakota perspective and an Indigenous perspective, or a settler perspective, rather. And I think it's important that we recognize, and we push students to recognize, that neither the Dakota nor settlers have ever been one singular, static, or group over time, right? There are settlers that, with a range of viewpoints on the U.S. Dakota War, and similarly, there are Dakota with a range of viewpoints, both historically and today. And I also think it's important to push beyond framing these settler and Dakota as two opposing groups that have been static and always opposing each other over the last 150 years. And I think in some ways these articles do little to help us push beyond this, right? They're providing a very particular narrative, and it's a narrative that I think is familiar to us. And so it's important, this is what I mean, when I talk about reading this settler archive against the grain. How can we push students to push past some of these narratives that exist within newspapers and imagine alternatives? I think often, because we're looking at historical newspapers, there is a severe lack of Indigenous voices or perspectives. And I have reservations about a curriculum on, say, the U.S. Dakota War that doesn't have a robust set of, sources from Indigenous peoples or, from Indigenous perspectives. And I think this is a curriculum that certainly lacks that. But our hope is that it pushes students and teachers to think about how might we engender a more critical settler perspective, or how might we critically analyze the settler narrative that has existed and been developed in the state over time. And in that way, hopefully this wouldn't be students only look at the U.S. Dakota War, but they would have a chance to engage with Indigenous voices as part of their study. And then I think this is something that my colleague Joe mentioned as well, but in piloting this curriculum, we were dismayed at points where students would come away thinking that, reporting that they were thinking that things were getting better over time. And, I often wonder if that's the case, right? Just because we don't see maybe, the same language used, such as savages used to describe Dakota, I wonder if, really things are shifting for the better, and if we would think about progress, or if we should really just think about settler colonialism and how it is shifting strategically to allow settlers to continue to dominate society. And so when we do see these shifts in language in places like newspapers, what does that really represent? And I think that's a difficult but important question, even for sixth graders to start to wrestle with. And so I think with that, I'll leave it here. Thank you so much. We hope that you'll be able to take up and use this curriculum in your classroom and the work that you're doing with students. Again, my email address is here, and I would love to engage if you have questions or thoughts or concerns or feedback, especially regarding the curriculum. I would love to have you get in touch with me and share some of that. Thank you so much.